Hello everybody and welcome. Thank you for joining us here today for the launch of the International Energy Agency's new report, World Energy Investment 2025. It's the latest edition of our flagship annual publication on investment trends across the energy world. I'm Jethro Mullen, head of the IEA's communications team, and I'm joined today by IEA Executive Director, Dr. Fatih Birol, by our Chief Economist, Tim Gould, and by the head of our Energy Investment Unit, Cecilia Tam, who is one of the lead authors of this report and is joining us today remotely from Brazil. The World Energy Investment Report is, I would note, freely available on the IEA website, along with an updated and expanded data explorer, which allows you to dig into the data trends yourself. So, during today's event, Dr. Birol will make some opening remarks, and then Tim and Cecilia will present the key findings of the report. We'll then take questions from journalists. For the journalists taking part in this press webinar, we invite you to send your questions via the Q&A function in the Zoom. You can do this at any point during the presentation, and we'll also take a 2-minute break right after the presentation for you to enter your questions. And with that, I'll hand over to our Executive Director, Dr. Birol.
Thanks a lot, Jethro. Greetings to everybody from International Energy Agency headquarters in Paris. Dear colleagues, today we are in front of you to share with you some of the key findings of our World Energy Investment Report. And this is a special one because this is the 10th edition of this very report. Some 10 years ago, with the new IEA management we have decided that we need to know, the world needs to know, what is the entire budget of the global energy sector. There are some studies, some reports covering oil, some on electricity, some of them for this country, some of them for the other. But we thought 10 years ago that there is a need to look at the entire global energy sector, each country, and all the fuels and all the technologies, oil, gas, coal, renewables, nuclear power, electricity, grids, efficiency, all of them, to understand what is the entire budget and how much it is spent to which energy sources. It is important for us to know these numbers because the security of energy systems, affordability of the energy sector, and whether or not we are addressing the emissions comes from those investment numbers. So this year we have the 10th edition, and I will share with you some of the findings. Then I will turn to my colleague, our Chief Energy Economist, Mr. Tim Gould, who oversaw this report, like he oversaw many major IEA studies. And also, I will also turn to my colleague Cecilia Tam, who is leading our investment team. So, dear colleagues, let me share with you some of the findings that I thought are important to underline. Number one, the headline number. The entire budget of our energy system, global energy system, this year we expect to reach $3.3 trillion US. It is about 2% increase compared to last year. But when we look at the 3.3, we see that about $1.1 trillion goes to investments for fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, and 2.2 to the rest, ranging from solar, wind, electricity, nuclear power, grids, and others. And this trend has been more or less, this division 1 to 2 constant in the last few years. Now, looking at the countries, there is one country I need to bring to attention, which is China. China, dear colleagues, has an immense role in global energy investments today. I mentioned to you that this report is the 10th edition. When I look at the 10th edition of this report today, I see that the China investments, total Chinese investments, are more or less equal to United States plus EU, and 10 years ago, China was only equal to United States. So huge growth of Chinese share in global energy investments. And today, about 27% of all energy investments are taking place in China, and the rest, all the other countries put together. China is today #1 investor in fossil fuels and #1 investor in clean energy infrastructure around the world. Now, after China, a few thoughts on oil and natural gas investments. For oil, we expect this year, 2025, oil investments to decline about 6%. And this is the first decline we see since almost 10 years, except for COVID. And this is happening, we believe, because of the uncertainties, because of the lower oil demand growth expectations, and lower oil prices. When we look at the natural gas, we see a different picture. Natural gas investments are still increasing, especially the LNG export facility investments in the United States and other countries see a strong growth. Dear colleagues, one of the key emphasis of this report is on the electricity sector. Again, when we published this report 10 years ago, investments going to oil, gas, and coal, they were put together, they were higher than investment going to electricity sector. But now it is exactly the opposite. Electricity investments are significantly higher than all fossil fuel investments put together. Capital is moving to the electricity sector. It is a clear trend because the electricity consumption is growing, and so are the needs to generate electricity. Again, when we look at which investments are going, which parts of the electricity generation technologies, solar comes as the #1 item here. In fact, solar investments are the largest item in all the investments we have in this year's report. And one striking finding, at least for me, as we have said also in previous years, the investment in solar this year are higher than the investment going to oil production around the world. Again, showing the importance of solar investments. Natural gas investments, as I mentioned, for natural gas electricity generation is growing, mainly as a result of the coping with the strong demand coming from data centers in the United States and beyond. We also see the nuclear power with the nuclear industry, nuclear power making a comeback we see that the investment trends are following this comeback trend, as IEA has predicted some 3.5 years ago. Our numbers show a significant increase in the nuclear investments around the world. A final point in the electricity generation I want to mention is coal. We see that the coal FIDs, final investment decisions, as of end of 2024, last year, reaching about 100 gigawatts, almost all of them taking place in China. So, dear colleagues, these are some findings coming from our report. A lot of important numbers, a lot of important trends to reflect, to think about our energy security, about the affordability of energy prices around the world, and also about our efforts to reduce emissions globally. But maybe before I turn to our chief energy economist, I can tell you that compared to previous years, I see that in addition to the usual drivers of global energy investment trends, we see that the energy security appears to be an important driver here, and there is a lot of policies, incentives to increase the investments in the technologies that are supporting the homegrown energy production. In some countries, it's renewables. In some countries, nuclear. In some countries, other energy sources. It comes as an additional driver of global energy investment around the world. With this, I would like to turn to my colleague, Mr. Gut, with very many thanks, Tim, to you and to your very able team to prepare once again such a report with lots of data on different parts of the energy around the world and a lot of question marks about the future of our energy system and a lot of implications for the policymakers. It is the governments, it is the energy industry, the finance industry, and beyond. So over to you, Tim.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Executive Director. And as you mentioned, this is the 10th edition of our World Energy Investment. So it was an opportunity for us to reflect on some of the changes that have taken place since 2015. And on the screen now, you can see the sort of big picture for total energy investment flows over that period. And you can see with our estimate for 2025, that continued pickup in capital flows this year, despite the economic uncertainty surrounding the current context. And there are some signs that some companies are adopting a kind of wait-and-see approach to big new spending decisions. But I have to say that the bulk of the investment that goes into the energy sector is not related to new investment decisions, but it's continued spending on existing projects. And that's the bulk of what we're looking at. And most of those existing projects, most of those already approved projects are proceeding by and large as planned. So where have we been seeing the increases in spending? As was mentioned, it's not really been about fossil fuels. So after a dip in 2020 during the pandemic, we're basically back to where we were, back to sort of the levels that we had in 2018 or 2019. But we are expecting a slight year-on-year decline in 2025, and that's largely because of lower spending on oil. We'll come back to that in a second. There's been a small increase in investment in low emissions fuels, but as you see on the screen, they remain quite a small part of the overall picture. The largest increase that we've seen has been in renewable sources of electricity, led by solar. So that's an 80% increase in spending in that area since 2020. as was mentioned by the Executive Director, we've seen a noticeable pickup in the last few years, a 50% rise in investment in nuclear over the last 5 years, and a slightly smaller increase on grids. But we've also had higher spending from consumers on more efficient appliances, but particularly on more electrified end uses, including that sharp rise in EV sales. How does this look like at the country and regional level? So this is where we were back in 2015. Remember, that's the year the Paris Agreement was concluded, and at that time we were also digesting the implications of quite a significant fall in the oil price. And as was mentioned, that's the year when China edged ahead of the United States as the single largest investor in the energy sector. So what's changed in those 10 years? First thing that stands out is the scale of that increase in China. That's over $350 billion worth of extra spending, extra annual spending that we're seeing for this year. And the increase on its own is significantly larger than the totals that we have for many other countries and regions. You can also see large increases in the US, in the European Union, in India, but watch out for that Africa number. Taken as a whole, energy investment in Africa has actually declined since 2015, and that's the product of a large fall in spending on oil and gas, and only partially compensated by higher investment in renewables. And that's a very worrying indicator for a continent that is 1.5 billion people, nearly 20% of the global population. And that's why we're working hard with many African countries on the investment frameworks that can mobilize more capital, both domestic and international. Here's the breakdown by country. Actually, US investment in fossil fuels has declined quite substantially over the last 10 years, but a lot of that has been down to increased productivity, lower costs. Let's have in mind that this is also a decade where oil and gas production in the US has increased very substantially, making the US a net oil and gas exporter. And as was mentioned, China is both the largest investor in fossil fuels due to relatively high oil and gas costs and that large coal sector, but also by a distance the largest investor in clean energy technologies. I wanted to dig in a bit on this question that the Executive Director mentioned on energy security, because you sometimes hear the view that if you're interested in energy security, you invest in fossil fuels, and if you're interested in emissions reductions, you invest in renewables. Well, the reality is a lot more complex than that. And when we look at the data and when we talk to decision makers around the world, it's clear that investment in transitions, in new technologies and infrastructure is really not only driven by climate policies. There are typically many other motivations in play, including costs, industrial strategies, air quality, and yes, in many cases, also energy security. And what we're looking at on the screen is large countries and regions that are dependent on fossil fuel imports. And we wanted to divide the period up into the period to 2022, but also then the period since the global energy crisis. And when energy security has loomed even larger in the decision-making of policymakers. So we can have, in a sense, a test case of what that increased focus on energy security has meant for investment flows. You can see in most cases, and Japan and Korea is an exception where the resources are limited, but in most cases you've seen a pickup in spending on domestic fossil fuel supply. But you've seen a much larger increase in investment in clean technologies and infrastructure, including renewables, grids, efficiency, end-use electrification. So for these countries and regions that you're looking at on the screen, the response to increased concerns about energy security has really been to double down on investment in new technologies and in energy transition. Turning now to oil, at the beginning of the year, we put together all of the announcements that companies make on their investment plans for the year. And our initial feeling was that investment in oil upstream would be flat in 2025, so similar to 2024 levels. However, more recently, demand expectations were revised down. There's more OPEC plus supply coming back to the market. Oil prices have come under pressure. And so those plans have been revised, and we now expect upstream oil investment to fall by around 6%. And that's enough to generate a small decline in overall fossil fuel investment for the year. And when we look at the reasons for those declines, the largest ones are seen amongst the tight oil operators in the United States, where that decline in the oil price is challenging profitability. There's also been some reduction of investment into new fields and some into existing fields. And that last category is very important, as it could suggest that production from these fields might see somewhat accelerated declines. And that's something that we're keeping a close eye on. And indeed, we're going to come back to those issue of decline rates in a special piece of analysis a bit later this year. Nonetheless, although that investment level has come down slightly, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're expecting production to drop. For instance, in the US shale patch, we've had mergers and acquisitions, we've had continued technology improvements that have brought down costs even further, and production is still set to grow in 2025. The trends, as was mentioned, are quite different for natural gas. We have upstream gas investment growing this year, spending on new LNG facilities are on a strong upward trajectory. And despite some delays and cost overruns for some of the LNG projects that are planned, between 2026 and 2028, we are likely to see some of the largest ever annual expansions in LNG capacity. And with that, I'm going to pass across to my colleague, Cecilia Tan. An audio coming through for you, but maybe while we sort that out, I can maybe just carry on talking, and then we may just do the transition over at the next slide. So this story is really all about the way that the age of electricity is shaping investment trends. The world is now spending, as you can see on the screen, around $1 trillion each year on new generation assets. That's up from around 600 billion a decade ago. And over that period, electricity generation has grown by about 30%, but investment new generation has grown twice as fast. And where has that dynamism come from? I mean, some elements have been broadly flat, but we have seen that notable pickup in spending on nuclear. But the main reason why electricity sector investments on the generation side has increased is really down to solar PV and wind. Solar investment has tripled over the period, wind up by 70%. But there's another element here that should give us some pause, some reasons for greater caution, and that relates to grids. Because while we've seen that large expansion in generation spending, the increased spending on grids has been much more modest. And in some countries, that's been compensated by rapid expansion in battery deployment. But the imbalance that you're looking at on the screen between developments on the generation side and on the grid side, that really does need to be addressed. Otherwise, it could have implications for electricity security. But the bottom line, as the executive director mentioned, is that spending on electricity, both for supply and for the electrification of mobility and buildings, industry, that now makes up more than half of total capital flows to the energy sector. So for energy investors, at least, the age of electricity is very much here. And now we'll try again and pass across to Cecilia.
Thanks very much, Tim. So let's take a look at the reasons for these trends. One of this is that deploying clean power is now cheaper than ever. After a high point reached in 2022, the cost for clean energy technologies like solar panels, wind turbines, and batteries have returned to their strong downward trend. Our clean energy equipment index hit a record low in 2024, marking a 60% fall from 10 years ago. The results of fierce competition in the clean energy manufacturing space, but also of cost reductions in key materials. The cost of utility scale batteries, for example, has dropped by around 2/3 in the last decade. A big reason for the most recent decline is related to the fall in the prices of lithium and other battery metals. Other areas, however, are seeing stronger inflationary pressures, particularly for grid materials like cables and transformers, which have nearly doubled in price over the last 5 years as a result of rising demand and supply chain challenges. Other parts of the energy system are also at risk of higher costs. There is pressure on US steel and aluminum prices, for example, and this is pushing up drilling costs for the oil and gas sector and for all large engineering projects. Rapid electricity demand and concerns about electricity security, as has already been mentioned by the executive director and by Tim, are also providing some upside for coal, although this is concentrated in specific markets. China started construction on almost 100 gigawatts of new coal plants in 2024, and India a further 15 gigawatts, pushing approvals to their highest level since 2015. It's not clear how much this capacity will run, so it's too early to reach conclusions on the implications of coal and emissions. In contrast, for the first time, there were no new steam turbine orders for coal-fired generation plants in advanced economies in 2024. But there has been a steady increase in recent years in coal supply investments, and we are anticipating another 4% rise in 2025. China, followed in some distance by India, is set to lead this growth in 2025. This is aimed at bringing coal to domestic markets, but also for new capacity and modernizing existing mines. Investments in low emissions fuels is set to reach a new high in 2025, but at less than 25 billion, it remains small in absolute terms. Hydrogen investment has been growing quickly in recent years, but IEA analysis in the Global Hydrogen Review has highlighted how difficult it has been for supply projects to move to final investment decision, and there has been some project cancellations or delays in the past 12 months, including 3 projects that had already reached FID. The common factor across all these investments in low emissions fuels, including for CCUS, is their high dependence on supportive policies. Europe, the United States, and China have put in measures to support project profitability through mandates, quotas, and subsidies. Over the past year, we've seen additional policies come into place. Brazil enacted the Fuel of the Future law, and the International Maritime Organization developed an important framework for the shift to low-emission maritime fuels. However, in other cases, existing measures are being revisited. Finally, let's take a look at how R&D spending on energy has been evolving, as this is a good indicator of strategic priorities and expectations. We observed an interesting and revealing trend. 10 years ago, the 20 largest spenders on energy R&D were dominated by the largest automobile manufacturers, a few manufacturers of heavy industry equipment, and oil and gas companies. While there were 2 companies on the list that had a focus on electrification and electricity technologies, the vast majority of companies on this list were innovating in fields associated with fossil fuels and combustion-heavy technologies or processes. The good news is this has since changed. There are now 2 new EV-focused companies on the list, as well as the world's largest battery manufacturer. New entrants also include companies that focus or seek to position themselves on equipment suppliers for electrification. There has also been a geographic shift in the composition of this list. The number of Chinese companies has increased from just 2 in 2015 to 6 today. We also have a new entrant from the oil and gas sector from Saudi Arabia. In addition, Most of the traditional automobile manufacturers on the list of the top R&D spenders have since recalibrated their focus to EVs and now have strong targets for EV sales. The R&D landscapes has shifted, pivoting towards electrification. From just 2 in 2015, the number of companies on this list that are focused on electrification has now reached 15, a strong sign of things to come. Thank you, and back to you, Jethro.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, and Tim for the presentation, and Dr. Birrell for the opening remarks. So we now have time to take some questions from journalists. We invite the journalists in attendance to send your questions through the Q&A function of the Zoom if you haven't done so already. And do please mention your media outlet along with your question. We're just going to take a 2-minute break to give you a chance to enter your questions, and we'll be right back. Thank you. Hello, welcome back. Well, thank you very much for the questions we've had so far. We'll start with one on developing countries. So what are the shortfalls in energy investment in developing economies? Where are these shortfalls really being felt? And then another one, you talked a lot about uncertainty. What sort of projects are still going ahead? And are you worried about shortfalls investment in the years ahead in some sectors? So for those opening 2 questions, perhaps Cecilia, you could speak a bit about emerging economies, assuming the connection holds up, and Tim on the project, the uncertainties and what's being affected, what's not being affected. Cecilia.
Thanks very much, Jethro. So in terms of where we see the biggest shortfalls in emerging economies, it's really in investments around grids and storage, as well as in energy efficiency in the building sector. Regionally, the largest shortfalls, as Tim already mentioned, is really in Africa, where we see far too little of the clean energy spending, despite being representing such a large portion of the population.
Thank you, Cecilia. Tim, on...
Maybe I can take this point on the implications of the uncertainty that's very visible when we look at the news. I think the projects that are most susceptible to that uncertainty are the ones that rely heavily on policy support. So maybe it's in the areas where some of the technologies are not yet fully cost competitive. And that's why we've seen some hesitation in some countries on moving ahead with some projects for example, for low emission hydrogen, as Cecilia mentioned. But elsewhere, our strong sense is that in the electricity arena, that very strong underlying demand growth for electricity that we're observing not just in emerging developing economies, but also in many advanced economies. That's providing some really strong underpinnings for new capital allocation decisions. And I think, there's different aspects to that, but where we have that strong growth, there will still be a very strong case for continued investments in infrastructure, but also on the generation side. I think something to watch out for there, and it was mentioned in the presentation, are the areas where we have tight supply chains, and that's been true for aspects of the grid side, so for transformers, but also for cables. But I think the order books are now looking pretty full also for areas like CCGTs, for combined cycle gas turbines as well. So maybe, the opportunity there is for technologies where there are already abundant supplies to the market, and I think we're seeing that in many countries for investments in solar PV. And then when we look at the oil and gas side, we need to be watching this very closely. For the moment, the analysis that our colleagues in the Oil Industry and Markets Division do on the short-term outlook still suggests that markets look well supplied. There is enough new supply coming through from non-OPEC plus countries, particularly in the Americas, to look after, to meet demand growth. But I wanted to come back to this issue of the underlying declines. Because the amount of investment that we need is very much linked, not to small variations in the demand outlook, but to the amount that we lose from existing fields. So we've estimated in the past that about 90% of the investment that goes into the oil upstream is just to compensate for those declines in production from existing fields. So that's something that we have to always be aware of when we consider the investment outlook for that sector.
Thank you, Tim. And just to complement your answer, you spoke about the work of the oil markets and industry team, and they have their medium-term outlook coming out on 17th of June, so in about 10 days. So do join us for that, which will give a picture through to the end of the decade for the outlook for oil markets, oil supply, demand, and so on. Perhaps time for just one more question we can squeeze in on one of the themes that really stood out in this year's report, and that is coal. Why is coal investment still growing, and what are the implications? I think perhaps our Executive Director can take that one.
Thanks. But before that, if I can go back, a very important point that Tim made here is the critical importance of decline rates when it comes to oil investments and oil security. So what I see is that the oil industry and the commentators focus a lot on the demand, how much demand will grow, how many thousand barrels per day, etc. But forget the critical importance of decline rates when it comes to global oil investment picture. And I am very happy that maybe Tim, once again I can underline here, my colleague Tim Gould, together with his team and the many colleagues around the IEA, are undertaking a major study on the decline rates, which we are going to publish towards the end of this year, which will make everybody understand that how important is to address the decline in the existing fields if we want to have a secure oil supply picture. I stop here with my thanks to Tim and his team for this important study to come together with Christoph McLeod. I think he's going to work on this as well, Tim. Then coming to the coal, I think Cecilia showed a very telling picture that since 2015, we are seeing for the first time such a big growth in the FIDs, final investment decisions for coal. It is mainly, in fact, overwhelmingly coming from one country, which is China. And when we look at a bit carefully, we see that the number one driver of this huge amount of almost 100 gigawatts of new FIDs in China is the electricity security. China had a few bitter experiences in the last few years because of the some blackouts, brownouts, and this happens especially in summer. If there is because of the very hot weather, if there is a strong increase in electricity demand, mainly driven by the air conditioners, more and more air conditioners come in the system. Plus, if it is a dry year, which means that the generation from hydropower is lower than usual, you need some firm power, and the Chinese government, in order to address this issue, push the button for the FIDs for coal. Of course, on one hand, this may support the electricity security in China. On the other hand, this is not a good news for the emissions for local pollution, but also emissions for the carbon dioxide and beyond. So this is an area that we are going to keep a close eye on. So with this, I turn back to you, Jethro.
Thank you very much, Executive Director. That is all we have time for. We've covered as many questions as we can in the time we have. If any journalists have further questions, we invite you to reach out to our press office and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much to Dr. Birrell, to Tim, to Cecilia. Thank you very much to the journalists for the questions, and thank you to everyone following this event online for your interest in our work. The full World Energy Investment 2025 is freely available on our website, along with the Data Explorer, so do please take a look. Thank you and goodbye.